The clock on the dashboard read 7:45 p.m. as James Wilson drove down Highway 16, his shoulders tight after a 12-hour shift at Pete's Auto Shop. Rain pounded against his windshield, and the wipers squeaked as they fought to keep up with the downpour. The radio played softly in the background, some old soul tune his father used to hum while fixing cars in their garage when James was just a boy. James rubbed his eyes, thinking about the leftover spaghetti waiting for him at home and his two kids, Damon and Lily, who were probably finishing homework with their Aunt Rose. He promised to be home early enough to read Lily a bedtime story. At 9 years old, she was getting too old for that tradition, but neither of them wanted to let it go just yet. The rain was coming down harder now, making it difficult to see far ahead. That's when James noticed the hazard lights blinking about 100 yards up on the shoulder of the road. As he got closer, he could make out a blue sedan with its front right side tilted awkwardly toward the ground. A woman stood beside it, holding her phone with one hand while trying to shield herself from the rain with a small umbrella that kept flipping inside out in the wind. James slowed down, debating whether to stop. He was exhausted, soaked to the bone from working on cars all day in the leaky garage, and Damon and Lily were waiting. But something his grandfather always said echoed in his mind. You never know when you'll be the one stranded, hoping for a kind soul to stop. With a sigh, James flipped on his turn signal and carefully pulled onto the shoulder about 20 feet behind the disabled vehicle. He reached into his glove compartment for the small flashlight he kept there and grabbed his worn baseball cap from the passenger seat. The rain immediately soaked through his jacket as he stepped out. James approached slowly, making sure the woman saw him coming. He'd been in this situation before and knew how scary it could be for someone, especially a woman alone, when a stranger approached on a dark, rainy evening. "Car trouble?" he called out, keeping a respectful distance. The woman lowered her phone, and James could see she was middle-aged, wearing what looked like office clothes under her open raincoat. Her hair was plastered to her face from the rain, and her expression showed both relief and caution. "Flat tire," she replied, raising her voice over the sound of passing cars and pounding rain. "Roadside assistance says they're backed up because of the storm. Could be another hour." She gestured hopelessly at her front passenger side tire, which was completely flat. James nodded. "I'm a mechanic at Pete's Auto Shop down on Maple Street. Name's James. I can change that for you in about 10 minutes if you'd like." The woman hesitated. James saw it, that brief flicker in her eyes, the supple shift in her posture. He'd seen it before. That moment of calculation, of risk assessment. He remained where he was, hands visible, expression neutral. "That's very kind," she finally said. "I'm Elizabeth. Elizabeth Parker. I was on my way home from work when I hit something in the road." James nodded and pointed toward her trunk. "You have a spare?" "I think so," Elizabeth said. "The car belonged to my husband. He passed away last year, but he was always prepared for everything." Her voice caught slightly, and James pretended not to notice. "I'm sorry to hear that. Do you mind opening the trunk? I'll get started." Elizabeth pressed a button on her key fob, and the trunk popped open. James walked around to check and found a donut spare tire and basic tools secured under the floor panel. As he began setting up, Elizabeth stood nearby, clutching her phone. "I can pay you," she offered, "for your time and help." James shook his head as he positioned the jack under the car frame. "No need. Just doing what anyone would do." Elizabeth gave a small, sad laugh. Not everyone would stop on a night like this. The rain continued to pour as James worked, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had changed hundreds of tires. Despite the weather, he methodically loosened the lug nuts, jacked up the car, removed the flat tire, and mounted the spare. "Do you live around here?" Elizabeth asked, trying to make conversation as she held her umbrella in a futile attempt to shield James from the rain. "About 15 minutes east," James replied, tightening the lug nuts in a star pattern. "Got 2 kids waiting at home. Boys 12, girls 9. "Oh, I work with children," Elizabeth said, sounding genuinely interested. "I'm the principal at Westridge Elementary." James paused for just a second before continuing his work. "That right? My daughter Lily goes to Oakwood." "That's a good school," Elizabeth nodded. "Your children have both parents at home." James focused on lowering the car back to the ground. "Just me. Their mom left when Lily was 3. We manage all right though. He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag from his back pocket, now thoroughly soaked. All set. This is just a temporary spare, so don't go over 50 miles per hour and get it replaced with a real tire as soon as you can. Pete's shop opens at 7 a.m. if you want to bring it in tomorrow. Elizabeth stared at him with genuine gratitude. You have no idea what this means to me. I was supposed to be home hours ago to finish preparing for a school board presentation tomorrow. I don't know how to thank you. James smiled slightly, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. Like I said, no thanks needed. Just, maybe someday if you see someone else who needs help, pass it on. Elizabeth nodded firmly. I absolutely will. As James turned to leave, Elizabeth called after him. Wait, at least let me get your contact information. In case the school ever needs a reliable mechanic, or just to properly thank you. James hesitated, then walked back and recited his phone number as Elizabeth entered it into her contacts. The rain had finally begun to let up just a little. Drive safe now, James said with a small wave as he headed back to his car. As he settled into the driver's seat, James checked the time, 8:17 p.m. He'd still make it home in time for Lily's bedtime story. Starting the engine, he watched in his rearview mirror as Elizabeth's car pulled back onto the highway, its hazard lights now off. James couldn't know it then, but this simple act, stopping to help a stranger change a tire in the pouring rain, would set in motion events that would change his life forever. But that was tomorrow's story. For now, he was just a tired mechanic heading home to his children, looking forward to leftover spaghetti and the familiar comfort of his daughter's favorite book. Elizabeth Parker woke up earlier than usual the next morning. The rain had stopped, but puddles still dotted her driveway as she carried her coffee to the porch. She sat down on the steps, wrapped in her late husband Robert's old cardigan, and thought about the man who had helped her last night. There had been that moment, that split second when James first approached her car, when she'd felt afraid. She hadn't wanted to feel that way. She prided herself on being open-minded, on teaching the children at her school about equality and fairness. Yet there it was, that instant of doubt, of prejudice she didn't even know she carried. The memory made her cheeks burn with shame. Some educator you are, she whispered to herself, watching a robin splash in one of the puddles. James Wilson hadn't just changed her tire, he'd shown her something about herself she needed to see. His kindness, despite her obvious hesitation, made her feel both grateful and uncomfortable. The discomfort, she realized, was growth, the kind she always encouraged in her students. Elizabeth checked her watch. She had a school board meeting at 4, but her first priority was getting a new tire. She picked up her phone and found James's number from last night. After a moment's hesitation, she dialed. Pete's Auto Shop, this is Vicky speaking. Oh, hello, Elizabeth said, slightly caught off guard. I was hoping to speak with James Wilson. He helped me with a flat tire last night. James doesn't start until noon today, the woman said. Can I help you with something? He recommended I bring my car in for a new tire. I have a spare on right now. Sure thing, honey. Bring it in whenever you're ready. We open at 7. Elizabeth thanked her and hung up. She finished her coffee, got dressed, and drove carefully to the shop, mindful of James's warning about the temporary spare. Pete's Auto Shop was a small building with 3 garage bays, located between a convenience store and a laundromat. The sign was faded, and the waiting area consisted of just 4 plastic chairs and a coffee machine that had seen better days. A heavy-set man with gray hair and oil-stained coveralls approached her as she entered. Morning, ma'am. What can we do for you today? I need a new tire, Elizabeth explained. I had a flat last night, and James Wilson from your shop helped me put on the spare. The man's eyebrows rose. James helped you. On his own time? Yes, he stopped when he saw me stranded in the rain. He was very kind. The man, Pete, she assumed, nodded with obvious pride. That sounds like James. Best mechanic I've ever hired, and an even better person. Let's take a look at what you need. As Pete inspected her car, Elizabeth noticed photographs taped to the wall near the register. Most showed cars in various states of repair, but one caught her eye. James in the center of a group of young men, all wearing overalls with the shop's logo. They were standing in front of what looked like a high school auto shop class. Does James teach? Elizabeth asked, pointing to the photo. Pete glanced over. Not officially. But he volunteers at the technical high school twice a month. Shows the kids basic car maintenance, some repair skills. Says everyone should know how to change a tire. He chuckled. Guess you know why now. Elizabeth smiled. How long has he worked here? Going on 8 years, Pete said, writing up an estimate. Started right after his wife left. Had a 2-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old son to support. Never missed a day of work, even when the kids were sick. His aunt helps out with childcare. Pete handed her the estimate. You need all new tires, truth be told. These are pretty worn down. But if budget's tight, we can just replace the flat one for now. Elizabeth examined the paper. The cost for all 4 tires was substantial, but not unreasonable. Let's do all 4, she decided. How long will it take? About an hour. Coffee's free if you want to wait. Elizabeth settled into one of the plastic chairs with a styrofoam cup of surprisingly decent coffee. She pulled out her tablet to review her presentation for the school board meeting, but found herself distracted by her surroundings. The shop was clean but worn. Tools hung in precise order on paperboards. A radio played classic rock softly in the background. Through the open door to the garage area, she could see Pete working on her car, moving with practiced efficiency despite his size and age. Something about this place reminded her of her husband. Robert had been practical like these men, skilled with his hands, respectful of hard work. Before becoming a principal, Elizabeth had taught art, creating things that hung on walls or sat on shelves. But men like Robert and James created function, solutions to problems. There was something beautiful about that too. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant at school, reminding her about the meeting. Elizabeth replied quickly, then noticed the time. Nearly 9:30 already. Pete finished sooner than expected, and by 10:15, Elizabeth was paying for her new tires. Will James be in later today? She asked casually as Pete handed her the receipt. From noon to close, Pete confirmed. Something wrong with the spare he put on? No, I just wanted to thank him properly. Maybe I'll stop by after my meeting. Pete nodded. He'd appreciate that, though he'd never say so. As Elizabeth drove to school, she found herself thinking about James's children. He'd said his daughter was 9. That would put her in 4th grade. His son at 12 would be in middle school. She wondered what kind of father James was. Dedicated, certainly, working long hours to support them. But the fact that he still made time to volunteer at a school spoke volumes. The school day passed in a blur of meetings, emails, and the usual minor crises that came with managing an elementary school. By the time the board meeting ended at 5:30, Elizabeth was exhausted but satisfied. Her presentation on the new literacy program had been well received, and funding was approved for the coming year. As she walked to her car, Elizabeth remembered her plan to thank James. She hesitated, wondering if it would seem odd to return to the shop. She wasn't even sure what she wanted to say beyond a simple thank you. But something pulled her in that direction anyway. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the desire to make amends for that moment of doubt. Or maybe it was just the kind of day where one small act of kindness deserved another. Elizabeth started her car and headed back toward Pete's auto shop, where the lights were still on and 3 cars waited in the bays. She didn't know exactly what she would say to James Wilson, but she knew with certainty that their paths were meant to cross again, and not just because of a flat tire on a rainy night. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pete's auto shop as Elizabeth pulled into the parking lot. Through the open garage doors, she could see someone bent over the engine of an old pickup truck. Even from a distance, she recognized James's broad shoulders and focused posture. For a moment, she sat in her car, unsure of herself. What exactly was she doing here? A simple thank you could have been a phone call or even a card. Yet here she was, drawn back to this place for reasons she couldn't fully explain. Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth stepped out of her car and walked toward the shop. The smell of motor oil and rubber filled the air. A radio played somewhere in the background, the same classic rock station from this morning. As she approached, James looked up from his work, recognition flickering across his face. "Miss Parker," he said, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. "How's the car running with those new tires?" "Much better, thank you," Elizabeth replied, suddenly feeling awkward. Pete took good care of me this morning. I wanted to thank you properly for your help last night." James shrugged, a slight smile crossing his face. "Like I said, it was nothing, just the decent thing to do." "Not everyone would have stopped," Elizabeth insisted, "especially in that rain. I realized I didn't even offer you a hot cup of coffee after you got soaked helping me." "Coffee does sound good," James admitted, checking his watch. "I'm due for a break anyway. There's a diner next door with decent coffee if you've got a few minutes." Elizabeth nodded, surprised and pleased by the invitation. "I'd like that." They walked side by side to the small diner attached to the convenience store. The place was nearly empty at this hour, a couple of truckers at the counter and an elderly man reading a newspaper in the corner booth. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with dyed red hair, smiled when she saw James. "Well, if it isn't my favorite mechanic," she said, grabbing 2 menus from behind the counter. "Your usual booth is open." "Thanks, Donna," James replied. "Just coffee for me. Miss Parker?" "Elizabeth, please," she corrected gently, "and coffee sounds perfect." Donna led them to a booth by the window overlooking the parking lot, where they could see both the auto shop and Elizabeth's newly tired car. After taking their order, Donna gave James a curious look but didn't comment on his company. "You're a regular here, I take it?" Elizabeth asked once they were alone. James nodded. "Pete lets us take our breaks here. Food's simple but good, and it beats eating in the break room with all the fumes." When their coffee arrived, Elizabeth wrapped her hands around the warm mug, gathering her thoughts. "I wanted to apologize," she said finally, meeting James's eyes directly. "When you first approached my car last night, I was hesitant." James' expression remained neutral. "It was dark, you were alone, I'm a stranger. Being cautious is just smart." "It wasn't just that," Elizabeth admitted, her voice dropping slightly. "And I think you know it." A silence fell between them, filled only by the clink of cups and the low murmur of the diner's other customers. James took a sip of his coffee before responding. "Look, I've been a black man in this town my whole life. I know what it's like when people see me before they see me, if you know what I mean." His tone wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact. "But you got past it. Not everyone does." Elizabeth felt a lump in her throat. His grace in the face of her prejudice, however momentary it had been, humbled her. "I'm a school principal," she said. "I spend my days teaching children to look beyond stereotypes, to see each person as an individual. And then in one moment, I failed to live up to that myself." "We all have moments," James said simply. "It's what we do next that counts." Elizabeth nodded, grateful for his understanding. "Pete mentioned you volunteer at the technical high school." James's face brightened. "Yeah, twice a month, teaching basic car maintenance. You'd be surprised how many kids graduate without knowing how to change a tire or check their oil." "That's wonderful," Elizabeth said sincerely. "Schools need more community involvement like that." "It's not entirely selfless," James admitted with a small laugh. "My son Thomas is interested in cars. I'm hoping he'll join the program when he's old enough. Right now, he's still in middle school." "And your daughter?" Elizabeth asked. "Lily?" James's smile widened, his entire face softening. "She's all about books and art. Nothing like her old man. Smart as a whip, though. Just finished a science project on renewable energy that blew her teacher away." "She sounds remarkable," Elizabeth said, noticing how James lit up when talking about his children. "You must be very proud." "They're everything to me," James said simply. "After their mum left, well, it's just been the 3 of us, plus my Aunt Rose who helps out when I'm working late shifts." Elizabeth hesitated, then decided to share something personal in return. "I lost my husband last year. Cancer. We never had children, kept putting it off until it was too late." "I'm sorry," James said, and she could tell he meant it. "That must be lonely." "It is," Elizabeth admitted. "The school helps. Hundreds of children to care about, but it's not the same as family." James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Community matters too, though. Found family, you know. The people who show up. Like stopping for strangers with flat tires?" Elizabeth smiled. "Exactly like that," James agreed, returning her smile. Their conversation flowed easily after that. Elizabeth learned that James had dreamed of opening his own garage someday, focusing on teaching young people the trade. He'd been saving for years, but between raising 2 kids alone and the rising cost of commercial property, it remained just out of reach. "Pete's been good to me," James explained. "Flexible hours when the kids need me, decent pay. But having my own place, setting my own rules, maybe hiring some of those kids from the technical program, that would be something." "It's a wonderful dream," Elizabeth said. "The kind of business that builds community." James checked his watch and sighed. "Break's over. I should get back before Pete starts wondering if I've abandoned ship." They walked back to the auto shop together, their steps synchronized without effort. At the entrance, Elizabeth paused. "Thank you for the coffee," she said. "And the conversation." "Anytime," James replied. Something about the word, the openness of it, gave Elizabeth courage. "Actually, I was wondering. There's a fundraiser at my school next Friday. A carnival for the new playground equipment. We could always use more volunteers for the booths if you're interested. Your children would be welcome too, of course." James looked surprised but pleased by the invitation. "What time?" "It starts at 4, goes until 8. James thought for a moment. "I could probably get there by 5 after my shift. The kids would love it." "Wonderful," Elizabeth said, unable to hide her delight. "Here, let me give you the details." She took out a business card and wrote the school's address on the back. Their fingers brushed as she handed it to him, a brief moment of connection that felt surprisingly significant. "I'll see you Friday then," James said, tucking the card into his pocket. "Friday," Elizabeth confirmed with a nod. As she walked back to her car, Elizabeth felt lighter somehow. What had begun as a simple thank you had become something more. The start of a friendship, perhaps. Or maybe just a reminder that sometimes the worst moments in life, like being stranded in the rain, could lead to unexpected blessings. What Elizabeth couldn't know, as she drove away with a wave to James, was that their coffee conversation had set wheels in motion that would change not just their lives, but the lives of many others in their community. The simple act of stopping to help a stranger had created ripples that would soon grow into waves of transformation. Friday afternoon came faster than Elizabeth expected. The school grounds buzzed with activity as teachers and parent volunteers set up booths for the fundraiser carnival. Colorful banners hung from the basketball hoops in the gym, and the smell of popcorn filled the air. Elizabeth moved from station to station, clipboard in hand, checking that everything was ready. "Principal Parker, where do you want the dunk tank?" called out Mr. Thompson, the 4th-grade math teacher who had somehow been convinced to be the first volunteer to get soaked. "By the fence, please," Elizabeth replied, marking it off her list. "And make sure there are plenty of towels nearby." As she worked, Elizabeth kept glancing at her watch. It was only 4:30, and James had said he wouldn't arrive until around 5, but she couldn't help feeling a flutter of anticipation each time she heard the gym doors open. Why was she so nervous? This was just a school fundraiser, and James was just another volunteer. But even as she told herself this, Elizabeth knew it wasn't entirely true. Their coffee conversation had stayed with her all week. There was something about James, his quiet dignity, his devotion to his children, his dream of helping young people learn a valuable trade, that resonated with her own values. "Earth to Elizabeth," said a voice beside her. She turned to find her assistant principal, Grace Chen, smiling knowingly at her. "That's the 3rd time you've checked your watch in the last 10 minutes. Hot date coming to our little carnival." Elizabeth felt her cheeks warm. Not a date, just a new friend who volunteered to help. "He's bringing his children." Grace hummed skeptically. "Would this be the same new friend you mentioned who changed your tire the other night? The one you've been talking about all week?" "I haven't been talking about him all week," Elizabeth protested, though she knew there was some truth to Grace's teasing. "You literally used him as an example in our staff meeting about community engagement," Grace reminded her. "And then again when we were discussing the mentorship program." Elizabeth sighed. "Fine. Yes, it's the same person. His name is James Wilson, and he's a mechanic at Pete's Auto Shop. He volunteers at the technical high school, teaching auto repair classes. I thought he might be a good person to know, that's all." Grace's expression softened. "It's nice to see you making new connections, Elizabeth. You've been so focused on the school since Robert passed." We've all been a little worried about you." Before Elizabeth could respond, the gym doors opened again, and this time, James walked in with two children beside him. He had changed out of his work clothes into jeans and a clean button-down shirt. The girl beside him, Lily, Elizabeth presumed, had her hair in neat braids tied with yellow ribbons, while the boy, Thomas, was tall for 12, with his father's serious expression. "There he is," Elizabeth said, trying to keep her voice casual. "I should go say hello." Grace followed her gaze and raised an eyebrow appreciatively. "By all means, don't let me keep you." Elizabeth made her way across the gym, weaving through excited children and chatting parents. When James spotted her, his serious face broke into a warm smile that made something in her chest tighten. "Miss Parker," he greeted her. "Elizabeth, please," she reminded him. "I'm so glad you could make it, James. And these must be Lily and Thomas." The children looked up at her with curious expressions. Lily gave a shy smile, while Thomas nodded politely. "Kids, this is Principal Parker from Westridge Elementary," James explained. "She's the one whose tire I helped change the other night." "The one who invited us to the carnival?" Lily asked, her eyes brightening. "Do you really have a bouncy house?" Elizabeth laughed. "We certainly do, and a dunk tank and a cakewalk and all sorts of games. Would you like me to show you around?" Lily nodded eagerly, while Thomas tried to look less interested than he actually was, in that way of almost teenagers trying to seem cool. "Lead the way," James said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Though I was promised volunteer work, not just fun and games." "Oh, don't worry. I have plenty of work for you," Elizabeth assured him with a grin. "But let's get these two having fun first." She led them through the carnival, stopping to introduce James and his children to several teachers along the way. Thomas's eyes lit up at the basketball shooting contest, while Lily was drawn to the face painting booth. "Dad, can I get my face painted?" Lily asked, tugging on James's sleeve. "Sure, sweetheart," James agreed, reaching for his wallet. "It's on the house," Elizabeth said quickly. "Least I can do for our volunteers." After getting Lily settled with the face painting and Thomas engaged in the basketball contest, Elizabeth turned to James. "I could use help at the ring toss. Our volunteer had to cancel at the last minute." "Ring toss it is," James agreed, following her to a booth decorated with brightly colored bottles. "It's simple enough," Elizabeth explained. "Kids get 3 rings for a ticket. If they get a ring around a bottle neck, they win a small prize from this box." She gestured to a cardboard box filled with trinkets and candy. "I think I can handle that," James said with a smile. For the next hour, Elizabeth found herself drifting back to the ring toss booth between her other duties. James was a natural with the children, encouraging the little ones and joking with the older kids. He even demonstrated the proper tossing technique to a group of kindergartners who were struggling to get their rings anywhere near the bottles. During a brief lull, Elizabeth leaned against the booth. "You're good with kids." James shrugged. "Had plenty of practice with my own, plus the high school students I work with." "Have you ever thought about teaching full-time?" Elizabeth asked. "You have a gift for it." "Can't say I have," James admitted. "Always been more comfortable with engines than classrooms. But I do enjoy showing young people how things work, watching them figure things out for themselves." "That's what teaching is all about," Elizabeth said. "Not just passing on information, but helping students discover their own capabilities." James considered this. "Never thought of it that way before." The conversation was interrupted when Thomas approached, a basketball under his arm and a confused expression on his face. "Dad," he said quietly, "isn't Westridge Elementary where Mrs. Washington's grandson goes? The one you're always fixing her car for free?" James looked uncomfortable. "I think so, yeah." Elizabeth raised her eyebrows. "Mrs. Washington? Dorothy Washington." "You know her?" James asked. "She's one of our most active grandparents," Elizabeth explained. "Comes to every event, volunteers in the library twice a week. Her grandson Michael is in 3rd grade. "Small world," James murmured. "Mrs. Washington mentioned that a kind mechanic keeps her old car running," Elizabeth said slowly, pieces clicking together in her mind. "That's you, isn't it?" James shrugged, clearly embarrassed. "Her social security doesn't stretch far, and Michael needs her to get to school events." Elizabeth felt something warm spread through her chest. This man, who worked so hard to support his own family, was quietly helping others too. Before she could respond, Lily came running up, her face painted with a rainbow butterfly design. "Dad, Miss Grace says they need help at the popcorn machine. The motor thingy is stuck." James looked at Elizabeth. "Think I should take a look?" "If anyone can fix it, you can," Elizabeth smiled. "The popcorn booth is our biggest moneymaker." As James followed Lily toward the popcorn booth, Elizabeth found herself watching him with new eyes. Their chance meeting on a rainy night was beginning to feel less like a coincidence and more like something meant to be. Grace appeared at her side, following her gaze. "So that's the tire-changing hero, huh? I can see why you're interested." "It's not like that," Elizabeth protested, though without much conviction. "No?" Grace challenged gently. "Then why are you smiling like that?" Elizabeth touched her cheeks, realizing she was indeed smiling. "He's just different from what I expected." "Different good." "Different wonderful," Elizabeth admitted quietly. "He fixes Mrs. Washington's car for free, did you know that? So she can bring Michael to school events." Grace nodded. "That explains why she asked me earlier if I knew that nice mechanic man who came with you." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "What did you tell her?" "That I just met him," Grace replied with a laugh, "but that he seemed like a good man." "He is," Elizabeth said softly, watching as James knelt by the popcorn machine, already identifying the problem with expert eyes. "A very good man indeed." What Elizabeth couldn't know then was just how many lives in their community had already been touched by James Wilson's quiet generosity, and how many more would be transformed once she decided to help make his dream of opening his own shop a reality. But that evening, as the carnival lights twinkled and children's laughter filled the air, the first seeds of that future were already beginning to take root. The school carnival had been a huge success, raising nearly twice what they'd expected for the new playground equipment. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth found herself thinking about James often. Their paths had crossed several more times: coffee after she dropped her car off for an oil change, a chance meeting at the grocery store where Lily had proudly shown Elizabeth her science project ribbon, and once when James had stopped by the school to fix Mrs. Washington's car in the parking lot after it wouldn't start after a Grandparents' Day event. Each encounter left Elizabeth wanting to know more about this quiet man whose kindness seemed to ripple throughout the community without fanfare. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Elizabeth sat in her office, staring out the window as students rushed to waiting buses and cars, colorful umbrellas dotting the schoolyard like spring flowers. The rain reminded her of that first night when James had appeared like some kind of guardian angel on the highway. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Grace entered, carrying a folder and wearing an expression that meant school business. "Got a minute? I wanted to talk about the mentorship program we've been discussing." Elizabeth gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Grace opened the folder and passed over a printed proposal. "I've been thinking about what you said, about finding community members with practical skills to mentor our students. Not just academic tutoring, but real-world skills." Elizabeth nodded, scanning the document. "This looks promising." "I thought we could start with a pilot program," Grace continued. "Maybe 4 or 5 mentors working with small groups of students. Focus on kids who are struggling with traditional academics but might thrive with hands-on learning." As Elizabeth read through the proposal, an idea began to form. "I wonder," she murmured. "What is it?" Grace asked. "You know James Wilson, the mechanic?" Grace smiled knowingly. "The tire-changing hero?" "Yes, I recall him." Elizabeth ignored the teasing tone. "He already volunteers at the technical high school. But what if we created something for younger students? Basic machines, how things work, maybe even simple car maintenance for the older kids. You think he'd be interested?" "I think he might be perfect for it," Elizabeth said, her excitement growing. "And it wouldn't just benefit our students. It could help him too." "How so?" Grace asked. Elizabeth sat back in her chair, the pieces coming together in her mind. "He wants to open his own shop someday. Focus on teaching young people the trade. What if we could help him with that? Create a partnership of sorts?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "That's thinking bigger than a mentorship program." "Maybe," Elizabeth admitted. "But imagine the possibilities. Our students get practical skills and positive role models. James gets to pursue his dream. The community gets a business focused on education and service. You're really invested in this, aren't you? Grace observed. Elizabeth nodded slowly. I think I am, but I need to learn more. About what James really wants, about what would make this work. So what's your next step? Grace asked. Elizabeth thought for a moment. Research. I need to find out more about what it would take to start a business like the one James envisions, and I need to speak with some of our school board members who have business backgrounds. And James? Are you going to tell him about this idea? Not yet, Elizabeth decided. Not until I have something concrete to offer. I don't want to get his hopes up prematurely. Over the next 2 weeks, Elizabeth threw herself into research. She met with 3 different school board members who had business experience. She talked with the principal of the technical high school where James volunteered. She even drove to a neighboring town to visit an auto shop that had a successful apprenticeship program. Each conversation, each piece of information strengthened her conviction that James Wilson's dream wasn't just good for him, it was something their entire community needed. On a sunny Saturday morning, Elizabeth found herself parked outside Pete's auto shop once again. She'd rehearsed what she wanted to say, but her heart still pounded as she walked through the open garage doors. James was working alone, his back to her as he leaned under the hood of a sedan. The radio played quietly, and he hummed along, unaware of her presence. Morning, Elizabeth called, not wanting to startle him. James turned, surprise crossing his face before it settled into a warm smile. Elizabeth, didn't expect to see you today. Car trouble again? She shook her head. Actually, I was hoping to talk to you. About something important. Do you have a few minutes? James checked his watch. Pete's out on a town job, but I'm supposed to finish this oil change before noon. He hesitated, then added, could you wait about 20 minutes? Then I'm due for a break. Of course, Elizabeth agreed, settling onto a plastic chair near the small waiting area. She watched as James worked, his movements efficient and practiced. There was something calming about seeing someone so completely in their element, someone who knew exactly what they were doing and took pride in doing it well. When he finished, James washed his hands at a utility sink and gestured toward the diner next door. Coffee? Perfect, Elizabeth said, following him outside. Once they were settled in what she now thought of as their booth, with coffee steaming in front of them, James looked at her expectantly. So what's this important thing you wanted to discuss? Elizabeth took a deep breath. I've been thinking a lot about what you told me, about wanting to open your own shop someday, focusing on teaching young people. James nodded slowly. Been a dream of mine for years now. What if I told you I might be able to help make that happen? Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite her nerves, not alone, but with help from others in the community. James set down his coffee cup, his expression guarded. What exactly are you suggesting? A partnership, Elizabeth explained. Between you, the school, and several business owners in town who are looking for ways to give back. She pulled a folder from her bag and opened it on the table between them. I've been doing some research. There's an empty commercial space on Oak Street that would be perfect for an auto shop. The owner is willing to offer reduced rent for the first year if the business includes a youth training component. James stared at the papers, his brow furrowed. Elizabeth, I appreciate the thought, but I can't afford to rent a whole shop, even with reduced rent. That's years down the road for me. That's where the partnership comes in, Elizabeth continued. The school board has approved a pilot program for practical skills mentorship. We want you to be our first mentor, James. It would come with a stipend that could supplement your income while you get the business off the ground. She pulled out another sheet of paper. And these are local business owners who are interested in investing in community projects. 3 of them have specifically expressed interest in your idea once I explained it to them. James looked up, his expression a mix of hope and disbelief. You did all this? For me? Why? Elizabeth felt her cheeks warm. Because I believe in what you want to do. Because I've seen how you are with young people, with your own children. Because our community needs more people like you, James, people who stop on rainy nights to help strangers, who fix elderly women's cars for free so they can bring their grandchildren to school events. She reached across the table, hesitated, then placed her hand gently on his. and because sometimes people with good hearts and important dreams need a little help to make those dreams come true. James looked down at her hand on his, then back at her face. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now, Elizabeth assured him. Look through these materials. Think about it. Talk to your children and your aunt. This would be a big change for all of you. It would, James agreed, his voice hushed. But it's everything I've wanted. There's something else, Elizabeth added, pulling out one final document. This is a draft proposal for bringing the program to Westridge Elementary. Having all the students from the high school program come mentor our students under your supervision, creating a pipeline of learning that could start as young as 4th grade. James's eyes widened as he read through the proposal. This is incredible. You've thought of everything. Not everything, Elizabeth admitted with a smile. I still need your expertise for the actual content of the program. And your decision, of course. This only works if it's what you truly want. James gathered the papers together carefully, as if they were precious artifacts. Can I take these home? Show them to Thomas and Lily. Think about it over the weekend. Of course, Elizabeth nodded. Take all the time you need. As they walked back to the auto shop, James was quiet, lost in thought. At the entrance, he turned to her, his expression serious. Thank you, he said simply. Not just for this. He lifted the folder, but for seeing me. Really seeing me from that first night. Elizabeth's throat tightened with emotion. Thank you for stopping to help a stranger in the rain. For showing me what true kindness looks like. They stood there for a moment, something unspoken passing between them, something that felt like the beginning of a story much larger than either of them had imagined possible when their paths first crossed on that rainy highway. The weekend passed slowly for Elizabeth. She checked her phone more often than she cared to admit, hoping to hear from James. By Sunday evening, with no word, she began to worry that perhaps she had overstepped, that her enthusiasm for his dream might have seemed presumptuous or intrusive. Monday morning brought the usual rush of school administration duties, but her thoughts kept drifting to James and the folder of possibilities she had handed him. Had she pushed too hard? Assumed too much? Just after lunch, her office phone rang. Principal Parker speaking, she answered automatically. Elizabeth? It's James Wilson. Her heart skipped a beat at the sound of his voice. James. Hi, how are you? Good, really good actually. There was something different in his tone, an energy she hadn't heard before. Listen, I was wondering if you might be free to meet this evening. I've been through all the materials you gave me, talked it over with the kids and my Aunt Rose. I'd like to discuss it further, if that's all right with you. Of course, Elizabeth said quickly, trying to keep the relief from her voice. I'm free after 5. Perfect. There's something I'd like to show you. Could you meet me at 732 Oak Street at 5:30? Elizabeth recognized the address immediately. It was the empty commercial space she had mentioned, the potential location for James's shop. I'll be there, she promised. The rest of the day crawled by. When the final bell rang at 3:15, Elizabeth found herself unusually indecisive about what to do with the 2 hours before meeting James. She organized papers on her desk, answered emails, and eventually decided to go home to freshen up before heading to Oak Street. At precisely 5:30, Elizabeth pulled up in front of the vacant building. It had once been a print shop, with large windows across the front and enough space for several car bays in the back. The location was ideal, close to both the elementary and high schools, on a busy street but with enough parking. James's truck was already there. As she got out of her car, she saw him standing by the entrance, a set of keys in his hand and a smile on his face that made her breath catch. Right on time, he said as she approached. Those are the keys to this place? Elizabeth asked, nodding toward his hand. James nodded. The real estate agent let me borrow them. Wanted to take a proper look before making any decisions. He hesitated, then added, I hoped you might want to see it too. Help me envision what it could become. I'd love to, Elizabeth said sincerely. James unlocked the door and held it open for her. The interior was dusty and empty, with marks on the walls where shelves had once been. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the large front windows, illuminating floating dust particles like tiny stars. It needs work, James acknowledged, watching her reaction. But the bones are good. Strong foundation, solid roof, updated electrical system. Elizabeth walked slowly through the space, already seeing possibilities. This front area could be your office and waiting room, she suggested. And through here. She moved toward the larger back section, will be the repair bays. James nodded, following her. 3 bays, maybe 4 if we configure it right. One could be dedicated to the student training program. Elizabeth turned to him, noting his use of we and the excitement in his voice. So you're considering it? The partnership idea? More than considering, James said, his expression growing serious. Elizabeth, what you've put together, it's more than I ever thought possible. At least at this stage of my life. He ran a hand along a dusty countertop. I stayed up most of Friday night going through those documents. Showed everything to Rose on Saturday. She cried, said it was an answer to prayers she'd been saying for years. And the children? Elizabeth asked softly. What did they think? A smile broke across James's face. Thomas is over the moon. Already talking about which of his friends he wants to invite to the program. Lily's excited too, though she made me promise she wouldn't have to give up her art classes to help at the shop. Elizabeth laughed. A girl who knows her own mind. I like that. She gets it from her Aunt Rose, James said, shaking his head with fond exasperation. Anyway, I've been doing calculations all weekend. With the reduced rent, the stipend from the school program, and the investment offers from those business owners. It's tight, but it's doable. His voice grew quieter. It's actually possible, Elizabeth. She stepped closer to him, unable to contain her own excitement. I knew it would be. Your dream isn't just good for you, James. It's good for this whole community. There's something else, James said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. I spoke with Pete yesterday. Told him what I was considering. He was surprisingly supportive. Said he's been thinking about retiring in a few years anyway. Offered me this. He handed Elizabeth the paper. It was a handwritten note from Pete, offering to sell James some of his older but still functional equipment at a deeply discounted price, with payments spread over 2 years. Pete said he'd rather see his equipment being used to teach kids than sold for scrap or to some corporate chain, James explained, his voice thick with emotion. He's even willing to send some of his regular customers my way once I'm up and running. Elizabeth felt tears prick at her eyes. That's wonderful, James. None of this would be happening without you, he said, meeting her gaze directly. You saw something in me that night on the highway, something worth believing in. You made it easy, Elizabeth replied simply. I just recognized what was already there. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by dust and possibility. Through the windows, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty floor. So, Elizabeth said finally, what's our next step? James's eyebrows rose at the hour, but his smile deepened. I need to meet with those potential investors, draft a proper business plan, figure out the legal structure for incorporating the educational component. I can help with some of that, Elizabeth offered. The school board chairman used to work in business development, and Grace, my assistant principal, her husband is an attorney who specializes in small business law. He might be willing to offer some pro bono advice. James shook his head in amazement. It's like everything is falling into place, almost too perfectly. Maybe it is, Elizabeth said softly. Maybe some things are just meant to be. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, a recognition that this partnership had grown into something neither had anticipated when Elizabeth's tire went flat on that rainy night. James cleared his throat. I should probably get these keys back to the agent. But first, how would you feel about grabbing dinner? Someplace nicer than the diner this time. The kids are with Rose tonight, and I'd like to celebrate this next step. With you. Elizabeth felt a warmth spread through her chest. I'd like that very much. As they locked up the building and walked to their cars, Elizabeth thought about the strange and wonderful path that had led them here. A flat tire that could have been just an inconvenience had instead become the first chapter in what promised to be a remarkable story. I'll follow you, James said as they reached her car. Elizabeth nodded, unlocking her door. Then, on impulse, she turned back and embraced him quickly. I'm really happy for you, James, for all of us. He returned the hug, his arms strong and steady around her. Thank you for stopping to help a stranger with a dream, he whispered, echoing her own words from their earlier conversation. for seeing me when others might have looked away. As they drove toward the restaurant, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Elizabeth couldn't help but think it looked like a beginning, the kind of sunset that promises even better days to come. What had started with a simple act of kindness on a dark highway was blossoming into something extraordinary, a partnership, a friendship, and perhaps something more. A connection that would not only change their lives but touch countless others through the ripple effects of dreams realized and barriers broken. 2 years later, the sun shone brightly on the freshly painted sign that read Wilson's Auto Repair and Training Center. A crowd had gathered in the parking lot, where chairs were arranged in neat rows and a small podium stood in front of a red ribbon stretched across the entrance to the newly renovated building. Elizabeth sat in the front row, smoothing down her skirt nervously as she watched James adjust his tie for the third time. He wasn't used to wearing one, but today was special. Today was the official grand opening, though the shop had actually been serving customers for nearly 3 months already. "You look fine," she whispered, reaching for his hand and giving it a reassuring squeeze. James smiled down at her, that same warm smile that had first appeared in the glow of headlights on a rainy night 2 years ago. "Just want everything to be perfect. We've all worked so hard for this." And they had. The journey from idea to reality had been filled with challenges, setbacks, unexpected problems, and even more unexpected blessings. The business plan had taken 2 months to perfect. The renovation of the building had gone over budget and behind schedule, as such projects often do. There had been paperwork delays, permit issues, and one particularly tense week when it seemed the whole thing might fall apart due to an insurance complication. But through it all, James and Elizabeth had worked side by side, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. And they weren't alone. The community had rallied around the project in ways neither of them could have imagined. Pete had not only sold James his equipment at a discount, but had also spent countless weekends helping with the renovation. Mrs. Washington had organized a group of senior citizens to bring home-cooked meals to the volunteers working on the building. Grace and her husband had navigated the legal complexities free of charge. And the original investors had brought in friends, expanding the pool of community support beyond anything Elizabeth had initially hoped for. "Dad. They're ready to start." Thomas, now 14 and inches taller than he'd been 2 years ago, called from near the podium. He wore a crisp blue button-down shirt with the shop's logo embroidered on the pocket, his proud uniform as the shop's junior apprentice coordinator. "Coming," James called back, taking a deep breath. Elizabeth stood, straightening James's tie one last time. "Ready to show the world what you've built." "What we've built," James corrected her gently, leaning down to kiss her cheek. Their relationship had evolved gradually over the past 2 years, neither rushing into anything but both recognizing the deep connection that had formed between them. 6 months ago, James had finally worked up the courage to ask Elizabeth on a proper date, dinner at a restaurant one town over, where they'd talked for hours about everything except the shop. Last month, he'd become a regular presence at her house for Sunday dinners with the children. They were taking things slowly, respectful of the children's feelings and the memory of Elizabeth's late husband, but moving steadily toward a shared future. Now, as James walked to the podium, Elizabeth felt a surge of pride so intense it brought tears to her eyes. She watched as he stopped to shake hands with the mayor, exchanged a word with the high school principal, and high-fived a group of teenage boys, his first class of student apprentices, who sat together wearing matching shop shirts. "Good morning, everyone," James began, his voice strong despite his nerves. "Thank you all for being here today. 2 years ago, I was just a mechanic with a dream. Today, that dream has become reality, but not because of me. Because of all of you." He gestured to the crowd, where neighbors, friends, customers, and supporters had gathered. In the back row, Aunt Rose dabbed at her eyes while Lily, now 11 and growing into a remarkable young woman, filmed everything on Elizabeth's phone. "Wilson's Auto Repair isn't just a business," James continued. "It's a community center, a place of learning, a bridge between generations and between different parts of our town." As he spoke, Elizabeth thought about the journey they'd been on. The shop had indeed become everything James had envisioned and more. During school hours, it served as a training facility for high school students interested in auto mechanics. After school, younger students came for the How Things Work program that Elizabeth had helped develop. Weekends featured community workshops where people of all ages could learn basic car maintenance or bring in broken household items for repair rather than replacement. And through it all, James ran a successful business, servicing cars with the same care and integrity he'd shown that night on the highway. "I want to thank a few people specifically," James was saying. "Pete Johnson, my former boss, who believed in me enough to help me become his competition." The crowd laughed as Pete raised his hand in acknowledgement. The business owners and community members who invested not just money but time and expertise. The school board who took a chance on a new kind of educational partnership. James paused, his eyes finding Elizabeth's. "And most importantly, I want to thank Principal Elizabeth Parker, without whom none of this would exist." A murmur went through the crowd as James gestured for Elizabeth to join him at the podium. She hadn't expected this and felt her cheeks warm as she stood and walked toward him. 2 years ago," James said, his voice softening, "I stopped to help a woman with a flat tire on Highway 16. I didn't know then that she would change my life forever, that her belief in me and my dream would create all of this." Elizabeth stood beside him now, blinking back tears as he took her hand in his. Elizabeth saw possibilities where others might have seen only obstacles. She created connections where there were none before. She built bridges that our whole community now walks across. He turned to face her directly. "Some people might call what happened that night a coincidence, a random encounter in the rain. But I believe it was something more. I believe some people come into our lives exactly when we need them, and sometimes, if we're very fortunate, they stay." The crowd broke into applause as James squeezed Elizabeth's hand. She hadn't prepared a speech, but words came easily. "What James isn't telling you," she said when the applause quieted, "is that he's the one who's been building bridges all along. Long before I met him, he was fixing Mrs. Washington's car for free so she could bring her grandson to school events. He was volunteering his time to teach teenagers skills they couldn't learn in a classroom. He was raising 2 amazing children on his own while dreaming of how he could give back even more." She looked out at the faces watching them, faces of all ages, backgrounds, and walks of life, united today in celebration of something good. "All I did was recognize what was already there." James did the hard part. He was brave enough to take a chance on making his dream come true. And now that dream is giving opportunities to so many others. Together, they turned to face the red ribbon stretched across the shop entrance. "It's my honor," James said, accepting a large pair of scissors from Thomas, "to officially open Wilson's Auto Repair and Training Center. May it serve our community for many years to come." As the scissors sliced through the ribbon, cheers erupted from the crowd. Music began playing, and people moved forward to enter the shop, where refreshments and demonstrations had been set up to showcase the various programs. In the happy chaos that followed, James and Elizabeth found a quiet moment near the edge of the parking lot. "Thank you," James said simply, looking into her eyes, "for everything." Elizabeth shook her head, smiling. "Thank you for stopping that night, for being the kind of man who helps strangers in the rain." "Best decision I ever made," James said, his voice low and sincere. As they rejoined the celebration, Elizabeth marveled at how a simple flat tire had led to such extraordinary changes, not just in their individual lives, but in the fabric of their entire community. What had begun as a moment of vulnerability and need had blossomed into something neither of them could have imagined. A partnership, a purpose, and a love that had grown slowly but surely, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values. Sometimes the most life-changing journeys begin with a single act of kindness, and sometimes the help we offer others becomes the very thing that saves us, connects us, and helps us become who we were always meant to be.